last session of today. Hope you guys will keep up with the Blazor heatness. They already put some curtains for me because I couldn't see anything on my laptop. So I'm going to talk about extending visualization of Microsoft Graph data to the HoloLens applications. A little bit about me. I'm a solutions architect working for ETU, which is a partner of Microsoft. Also mostly called HoloLens evangelist, because I'm actually spamming a lot on Twitter, LinkedIn, and any other platform, everything around HoloLens. I became, beginning this year, Windows Development MVP, but specifically only for mixed reality. Next to that, I'm running in the Netherlands the mixed reality user group, so just check the website once. And I'm doing, together with somebody else, the Global AI Bootcamp, which is a worldwide bootcamp we're going to do on October the 13th, together with Henk Boelman. And the idea is that you have, at one date, on every country, talking about AI and mixed reality. So some other details and the Creative Commons license. So, the agenda for today, what are we going to build? I want to talk a little bit about mixed reality and HoloLens. Anybody knows HoloLens already? Only one, two? Okay, a few. So I will keep that short. Then I'm going to continue to Microsoft Graph. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about mathematical visualization. And then how you can everything connect together to actually get the HoloLens application. I'm a very lazy developer. I don't like to program that much. So I learned a lot of coding. I will show you how you can actually bind everything together. So first, what are we going to build? We're going to build an HoloLens application which will get people and related people, to make it a little bit easy, through the Microsoft Graph from a Office 365 tenant. Then I'm going to visualize it in some kind of 3D model, because when I'm going to Delve, for example, if anybody knows Office 365, you want to see the relations, it's mostly not really clear. It's a lot of information. It's always flat. And it would be interesting to actually put that information together in a 3D graph inside the HoloLens, when I can actually walk around the model and select specific parts within the model. And then we're just going to show you the model and how you can actually interact with it. So first start with mixed reality. Mixed reality, this is actually the first version of the HoloLens when they start building the HoloLens. Can you imagine? Cables and stuff. So it's now finally something smaller. So if you talk about realities, anybody knows VR? VR means that we are actually having non-real environment around me. Everything is virtual, meaning that I don't know what's happening around me. And for myself, in 5 minutes, I don't know where I am. And you get things like moving your controllers and hitting people which are next to you. Secondly, you have augmented reality. A lot of times, HoloLens is said that it is augmented reality. But augmented reality is in principle the real world, enriched with holograms and data, which is virtual, but still like a head-up display. So it's not actually connected to your environment. And there is the difference with mixed reality. That's the reason why we talk about mixed reality. With mixed reality, I'm able to attach holograms and stuff to walls, floor, ceiling, tables, anything what you want. So that's the difference. For HoloLens, all three are possible, and I'm going to show you actually how that works. So to give you an idea of some of the specifications, an HoloLens is a self-contained device, meaning it has its own computer, and the computer is only located in this part of the HoloLens. It's running a 32-bit framework. It has no possibility to attach a USB drive, so it has its own memory. That's the max what you can get. It has no moving parts, so it cools itself through these vents. But meaning it's also self-protecting. As soon as it gets too hot, it turns itself off for protection. So the rest of the slides, I'm going to talk you through this. Before I'm going to demonstrate it, the device has a lot of sensory. Some of you guys maybe went to the session this morning in the other room. They explained a lot about the HoloLens. It has a lot of sensory, so I'm not going too deep in that. But what's very important is it has also 5, actually 6 cameras. 4 camera and a depth camera, and 1 is a video camera. The 4 camera and the depth camera are used to spatial map your environment. Even while I'm not wearing it at the moment, it's turned on. It scans the environment and it knows what it is seeing around 3.5 meters. So that's the idea. So to show you how it works. So I'm going to give you a live preview of what I'm seeing. There is some latency, I presume. Yeah, a little bit. So I'm able to use gestures. And I used just a standard gesture just to open the menu. And the menu still stays within my screen. So this is actually called Augmented Reality, because it's only attached to me. So I'm now able to select, for example, to make it easy, holograms, which is just an application. It starts. And then I can select, for example, a painting. And I have a painting which I can move around. And that normally you did this like this. And then put it, for example, on the wall. Through the menu. But the difference now is that this is a pre-release software, so I'm able to actually take it with 2 hands, resize it, rotate it, anything what I want. So the software is actually getting better and better. Now, to give you another example, which uses the environment, this is actually a new built city place, and this app allows you to place that, for example, on the ground. And you're able to add trees, benches, and all other kind of stuff, and then actually walk around the environment. It's just a small MVP thing. So let's say we place it here. So I now have a small village. You can call it like that. And I'm able to, for example, add trees into the environment by using gestures. And for example, if I want to see from a specific location, I'm actually now using virtual reality within a HoloLens. So I'm able to walk around at real size in my environment. So it gives you some of the ideas what's possible with HoloLens. If you have any questions, just ask. It's hot. So next thing I want to talk about is the Microsoft Graph. Anybody knows about Microsoft Graph? Nobody. Okay. Microsoft has a lot of applications running in the cloud, which is mostly put under one system, which is called Office 365. Think about things like, well, it's actually in Office 365 and in Azure AD, in Azure. So think about identities, think about a SharePoint environment, which is a collaboration tool, but also other small applications. The whole platform contains a lot of data, and Microsoft has built something called what they call the Unified Graph, and the Unified Graph is actually called nowadays Microsoft Graph. They want to keep the name in there. And it allows me to have one single point to authenticate and to access any of that information. So I'm now able to use a single entry point to get all kinds of information and that get back into like a JSON payload. So that system is very well documented. And it has version 1 and beta elements in there. So, for example, some of the functionality, which is still in development, they allow you to actually try that stuff out. I'm going to show you with the Graph Explorer. They also have what we call the Graph Explorer, and the Graph Explorer allows us to try everything on, in a web browser and see what the data is, what I'm getting back. To build an application which talks with Microsoft Graph API, you need to do an app registration, you need to do authentication, you do the API calls, and you need to do in some way to return your data. In our case, we want to do the people and the related people. So to do app registration, there's a website for there. You can go into there, and it is currently a separate website. It will be part of the Azure portal. And you can register it with an organizational account, which is an account which is created in a tenant. For people who don't know what a tenant is, an Office 365 tenant means, let's say I have a company, Contoso, and my company wants to have a collaboration environment, then I create an Office 365 tenant. In that tenant, I create identities, which are my employees and myself, and such an employee account we call an organizational account. So Microsoft also offers something which is called Microsoft accounts, meaning that I can share stuff with people outside the organization which do not have an organizational account, and then they can create their own Microsoft account based on for example, a Gmail account or another domain, anything you want. So the system here allows you, by app registration, to handle Microsoft account as organizational account, which is actually new for Microsoft because only organizational accounts are possible. You need to select some of the platforms you're building the app for. So for example, if you're building a web application, you use the web platform. In our case, we're going to build a native application. HoloLens is a Windows 10 system, meaning everything I built on a HoloLens is a universal Windows app, which means it's native application. So the second thing I need to do is to define what the scopes and the consent. Scopes means that I need to specify by the app registration what type of data I want to have access to. That doesn't mean that if I don't have the access to specific sites or information that I get the data. It only tells the application that that application which I registered can access that kind of information. The application itself still needs to do that under an identity. And only the identity determines if you get actually the data from the system. In the old days, you needed to do that with app registration. In the new days now, you can actually do it in your application, which allows you to have more control from your application. For example, audiences, what they can and what they can't access. Another thing which is important is that when I'm going to start up the application, I think I already did, I need to enter my identity, which is my email and password. Both will show up a screen saying to me, the made application use all those scopes. And that means that I'm going to give the application the consent to use my account using those scopes. But it's also possible to use what we call an admin consent. An admin consent means that I can actually say that application is allowed by the administration to be used by anyone. So you don't have to give the consent anymore. So to make it yourself easy, there's also something like a guided setup, because normally when you build an application, you have to do a lot of coding and stuff. The guided setup actually helps you through the whole process of registration the app, makes it very easy, defining the scopes if you want to do it at that time, and it actually generates code for you, which you can copy into your application. If you're writing C# or for iOS or Android, it doesn't matter. And it will run. It even makes sure that you have the right authentication. Normally, you authenticate against a Office 365 or Graph with what we call ADL. ADL is an authentication library, but that can only use organizational accounts. Microsoft just released, or in preview, the MSOL, and MSOL is the new Microsoft authentication library, which allows you to use both organizational as Microsoft accounts. And it's very easy. It's just a reference to an identity, to a Microsoft identity.client NuGet package. So for our application, we want to have data which is people and their relations. This is an example of how data is stored within Office 365. So you have different persons which have relations with each other depending on if they have been working on the same document, or if a document is shared with them, or if it has specific tags, or you did a report, or for example, the user in that case has a manager. And all those relationships are stored within Office 365. The cool thing is that the Microsoft Graph allows me to get that information. So what I can do with the Microsoft Graph is just running a URL called graph.microsoft.com/version1, which means my version 1 endpoint. Me means I, the one who logged in, and people give me all the people who are related to me. But I'm also possible to do a call based on a user. So if I make a recurrent or an application, I can actually get everybody and all their relations. And that's what I'm going to do. But doing that stuff means I have to write a lot of code to handle the JSON, which I get back, to do stuff with data, to make it easy. I told you guys I'm lazy. So Microsoft has created something which is called the Microsoft Graph API, which is also a NuGet package. And that allows you to do with very simple code and gives you objects back which contains the data you need, which makes it very easy. So to give you an idea, this is going to be a challenge because I have a lot of sun now in my display. I think, yeah, that's better. So to give you an idea, this is the Graph Explorer, which is just online, which you can just go to. And I have logged into as the mod administrator. This is my Office 365 tenant. And I'm now able to get data. So let's say I want to get me, I run a query, and I get every data. I'm not sure if, yeah, you can read it there. You see I'm the mod administrator. But I can also say I want to do, for example, all the people which are related to me. And that will return a rather long list of people. And for example, and also groups, it returns more than that. And each of the items you get back has an identity which I can use. So for example, if I want to have the person here, I can actually replace users with the ID. And that gives me back all the people for that user. And if I just want to have that user itself, I can actually do it like this. And this is just people, related people and users. You can imagine how many different calls you can do. So for example, to give you an idea, these are all the categories of possible entry points you have within a unified graph, which is an enormous amount of calls you can do. But in this case, to make it a little bit easier, we keep it to people. So when I'm getting that data back into my application, I need some form of visualization. And for HoloLens, there is what we call the Mixed Reality Toolkit. And the Mixed Reality Toolkit gives you a lot of additional stuff which you can build HoloLens application with. And one of the things is, for example, an object collection. It allows you to create objects around a sphere. But still the problem exists that it is flat data shown in the air. What I actually want to do is show people, like for example nodes, and show their relationships, what we call later on edges, and just let the model remodel itself depending on how good the model works. And the cool thing is that there is something called force detect graph. And force detect graph is actually a mathematical model which allows you to create nodes and relations between those nodes. So how does it work? And you already see some example on the right. Data is positioned by nodes. So we're going to do people like nodes. And relations between the nodes are called edges. What the algorithm does is it forces, depending on the amount of relationships, the nodes to each other or from each other. And that's actually done dynamically. Meaning that when I'm doing this in my application, while I'm adding stuff, which is actually called asynchronous from the cloud, so you don't get all the data in once, I get data per person and the relationships too, you will see that the data model is growing. Now, to use such a model, there are a lot of stuff found online which explains how the algorithm works. There are also a lot of people wrote stuff around this. And the only one which actually did it right and made a C# project for that, which is cool because HoloLens applications are C#, is a guy from Canada called Woon Ki La. I'm not sure if he's actually from Canada, but it's sad. And the cool thing is he wrote a C#, very easy script, some classes, which allows me to do an algorithm. There were some little things in there which I had to change to make it actually work on a HoloLens, but we got it to work. So, to give you an idea of what is going to happen, I don't need them yet. So, when I'm building applications for HoloLens, I'm doing that within Unity. And people know Unity? I hope they do. Ah, glad. Thanks, that's cool. Unity is actually a gaming, we're going to call it a game build environment. I don't think the name is right for that because it does a lot more. And gladly, Microsoft did decide to actually not build their own environment to build this kind of stuff, but thought about to use actually Unity. So they're using Unity when you build HoloLens applications. So I have a scene. In this case, this is my scene. It contains a camera, directional lights, if it's needed. And in this case, I have an empty object graph, which is an empty game object, which doesn't show anything, which has a script on it, and which is going to create nodes on the fly for me. Also have something which is called a gaze cursor, where I come back to that later. So if I'm running this within Unity, I hope it's doing. Oh, always fun. Well, what you will notice is it went really quickly, actually. We'll start it again. And it doesn't good in the play mode, so I always have to get back to the scene to actually show you the effect. But what you see here is that it is actually moving around. You see small lines between, and the small lines are actually the relationships between the nodes. In this case, I just generate 100 nodes and some relationships, nothing more. We want to use this model within a HoloLens and then connect it to the data I'm getting back from the graph. I'm a little bit worried about my laptop. My laptop is running a lot of pre-release software, and since a few weeks, it actually, as soon as I it tries to access the GPU of my laptop, it just shuts down. So if it happens, I need to restart, but you're warned. So what we now have is talked about a Office 365 tenant. We talked about Microsoft Graph to get data from that tenant. And we talked about visualization of the data all together. And now we want to build that for an HoloLens application. So the things I need to do first is, and I already showed you, a part of that is set up a project in Unity for building a HoloLens application. I need to add some prefabs. Prefabs are actually predefined game objects with controls or data, with scripts, with components on it. And it allows me to instantiate from a prefab so I can create nodes on the fly and edges. Edges is a rather difficult thing because lines within HoloLens is more difficult than you think. If you do it in the Unity editor has there something called gizmos, but that doesn't work on a HoloLens. So in HoloLens you need actually to render a line. Rendering a line is very difficult because it's actually not a line. You're looking at a flat stuff of particles which is created. You can imagine the more lines, the more heavier for the application. So that makes it rather difficult. Another thing is I use the Microsoft Graph from a separate DLL. From a Unity perspective, would you think you will build everything within Unity? But I'm a C#.NET guy, and I think Unity should only be used for building 3D stuff, meaning that every other functionality or business intelligence what I want to build, I keep out of Unity. Secondly, Unity is not asynchronous. I know there is something called coroutines with yield, but still it's not asynchronous. You're actually stealing from one thread a little bit of the time. I don't want to do that. I want to be true asynchronous busy. So keeping that in a separate DLL, which is just .NET framework, allows me to do that. And there's secondly also something difficult. I need to include a lot of NuGet packages. And the versioning needs to be good. And it's too difficult to go into that, but HoloLens applications make it rather difficult when you want to include all kinds of packages to add them. So then we need to integrate the force detect graph code, and we need to do some coding to access the DLL and the FTG. Then I need to add code to access the DLL, but for the people who know Unity, there are two options I can do. I can create a dummy DLL which has the same methods, which allows me to also compile it in Unity. I'll come back to that later. Or use like the pre-compiler directives if not Unity editor. The reason for that is very simple. I'm going to use stuff which is actually not supported by Unity. Meaning that as soon as I try to change assets, I need to get back to Unity to rebuild my Visual Studio project. But I'm using stuff which is not allowed, causing Unity not to build my application. So by using things like the pre-compiler directives allows me to rule out a lot of code which I don't want to be compiled by Unity, but will be compiled when I'm actually compiling against HoloLens. So in the last part I need to do is add some mixed reality parts like the gaze, which is the cursor, and some gestures and interaction. So I'm going to show you guys. We'll get back to Visual Studio. So there are a few things I've done. One of the main things is for HoloLens, I need to adjust the camera. The camera uses a solid color in black. That's needed because for HoloLens, everything which is black is transparent. It also means that if you do demos for HoloLens, don't do it in a black environment because it will not see anything anymore. Spatial mapping is totally not working. So another thing you can define is your clipping planes, which allows you to specify how close you can get to your HoloLens holograms before they just disappear. Now, directional light is not really necessary. In the other talk, somebody already told they went to the lowest quality of graphics with HoloLens. I'm more the guy who starts with low and then moves up as long as HoloLens accepts. In the old version software of HoloLens, you had to stay on lowest quality. But the analog team of Microsoft has done a pre-release of the software, which is available, which is on my device too. And that pre-release is much better in spatial mapping, but also in the underground software, which allows you to use a much higher level of quality for your projects. So higher quality is possible. As you can see here, I also have my prefab for a node. In this case, that's just a node and a text, nothing more. And I have an edge which just use something called a line renderer, which allows me to render lines. And it all starts within my graph empty game object, which has a graph controller, which I have mentioned what prefab I can use for node, one for the edge, and some other values which are needed for my mathematical visualization to let it move correctly. That has to do with values which allows the model not to go expand too much or to move or continuously stay moving instead of going to a static version. So what I've done in code I hope you guys can see it. I can't see almost anything on my screen anymore due to the sun. So to give you an idea, when you build HoloLens applications, you use Unity. Unity builds the solution. It creates for you a Visual Studio solution. That Visual Studio solution creates two projects. One is the code you have been using within your Unity, and one is the actual universal Windows app solution you're going to deploy to the HoloLens. Now in this case, you will notice that I have added some code for the FDG, which is just rented from the guy with a difficult name. I did some minor changes to get it actually to work for your HoloLens, and I add some extra stuff like the graph controller, which allows me to do a lot of things to get the data. Because I'm using a external DLL, means that the calls to to MicrosoftGraph are done asynchronously. The problem is when I get the data back, and I do that with a delegate, and you want to try to create a game object, Unity is, or actually the application is going to complain that it's not allowed, because you can only create game objects on the thread of Unity itself. So what we use is actually a very simple technique where we use a queue, and the queue is a list of persons and relations which I need to create, and that is filled by the delegate which is called by the external DLL. Then within my update method, I check the queue, and as long as there is something in the queue, I ask to create the game objects. And that helps me to build the model. So secondly, what I've been doing is building in gestures. And gestures for HoloLens are very easy. You use something called the gesture recognizer. You just need to create the object. You need to add the tapped event and to say start capturing gestures. That will give your application the possibility to use click gestures and to do some actions on that. The action which I have put in there is as soon as the model is built, I can select one of the nodes, which is a user, and it will then only show at that time the related people in the first degree. So I'm now going to show you the application. let's clean up my desktop. So there's a little bit of latency, I think. Yeah, a few seconds. So I start up the menu again. Then look for my app. In this case, it's called Office Sketch. It's starting up the application. So I'm just now starting a universal Windows app, nothing more. The difference is that it has a 3D environment. It could be that it's going to ask me the credentials, but because I already used the application, it could also be that it knows my credentials and goes through with the application itself. Nothing is happening. Ah, there it is. For you guys, it will be a little bit short. So as you see, it's actually now getting through the graph persons, people, and the related people, and the relations from an Office 365 tenant, which can actually be any tenant you have. And you will notice that the graph, that the force detect graph, is looking to move the nodes in such a way that it has the least crossings on edges. So I now possibly can go deeper by the model, and in this case I only put the name on one side, but I can actually walk around the model because the model is in one place. But the names are in the front, so I will go back to the front. So I also added some gestures, like for example I can select Henrietta Mueller, and that will show me all the relations she has with the first level. Secondly, for example, Deborah, which has almost the same. Alex Wilbur has only 4. One of the things I couldn't get at the moment is what the relation stands for. It has to do with the fact that I'm using lower versions of the NuGet packages. But as soon as I can increase that and it will work on HoloLens, then we can actually mention if it's because of a document. In that case, I can also get the document in front of me and show that in 2D, so you can start working using a HoloLens. So this model still works. And as you also notice is that the model comes to a stop, so it's not moving anymore, because the algorithm is continuously called. It moves a little bit, I think. And that depends on the values you're using, if you're using the correct damping values or anything else. I selected that one, so very easy. So with that, I come to an end with my session. And I want to thank you for being here. So thank you. So if you have any questions, ask. No questions? One?
Yeah, the department I work at ING has recently received a couple of HoloLenses to develop for. And we're also deploying them at events like this one. And well, I'm noticing you're using something different for streaming the HoloLens than the default HoloLens application from the Windows Store.
Oh, you mean the way of how I'm streaming?
Yeah, how you're streaming.
Yeah, I think that's because it's not different, but I presume your HoloLenses, because I know you guys have the expensing one, because they need to be secure.
Yeah.
I'm running pre-release software. And the pre-release software also gives you another interface for the Windows Device Portal. So this is actually the new Windows Device Portal.
Right.
But it looks very differently, but it has all the stuff in there. So that's the reason why it looks different from what you're used to. And you also notice, that's maybe a very good point, it would be interesting to have a look if you're able to experiment with the new pre-release software, because I'm not sure if you guys are doing stuff with, for example, spatial mapping. Spatial mapping is increased enormously, meaning that if I'm walking around, it will see the chairs and it will see you. And it scans. I'm not sure if I can actually show the people so they know what I'm talking about. Let me see if that works. I think I lost my connection. Oh, the HoloLens lost its connection. But if you scan, it will take actually more than a few seconds to rebuild when you move away. With this, it's less than a second. And it's only software. So it's incredible that the team by Microsoft has increased the capabilities of HoloLens just by rebuilding software. And that's just the first step. The next step will be in 2019 when they come with a new version of HoloLens. But I can't say anything about that. So, other questions? Okay, thank you again.